Well, for a bit more analysis on the election in Poland, let's bring in Aleks Szczerbiak, a politics professor at the University of Sussex. Aleks, this election seemed to show a real divide there in Poland.
Absolutely. Poles are divided down the middle in terms of their attitudes towards the law and justice government. And that was reflected in the result. And that divide is a very strong one. But the country is very polarized on this issue. And that's why there was such a high turnout, one of, if not the highest turnout in any post-1989 Polish election. The country really is very divided. And the election was effectively a referendum on the law and justice government.
Right. And it seems at this point, we're still waiting for the final numbers, but there is a bit of a margin. And yet still, the mayor of Warsaw came quite close to Duda, if the numbers we have now are correct. Is that something that might make the rulers of the Law and Justice Party worry?
Well, I think it won't have been any surprise how close the election would have been. I think they would have liked a bit more of a wider margin and to have expanded their electoral base a bit more, particularly because Andrzej Duda is personally very popular. He's Poland's most popular politician. He has very high approval ratings. But there are obviously a significant number of people who would have voted for him personally, but don't like the law and justice government and were anxious about the idea of concentrating too much power in its hands. And I think that's the dynamic, really. These were the sort of the key voters. Were they people who basically like the law and justice government, like its policies, like Andrzej Duda, people in sort of the provinces, medium-sized towns, or are they people that are worried about too much power being concentrated in the government, wanted to use this as an opportunity to register their discontent and a protest against the government? So obviously the law and justice would have liked to have had a larger victory, particularly given Mr. Duda's popularity. But I don't think that they will be surprised how close it was. It was always going to be a close election because Poles are really divided in their attitudes towards the government.
And to enhance that divide, if you like, Duda seemed to lean even more and more to the right during the campaign, for example, denouncing LGBT rights as an ideology. What do you think another 5 years of his presidency will bring? Well,
Andrzej Duda's strategy was very much to mobilize his supporters and his base. It wasn't a centrist campaign. It wasn't trying to win over the centre ground, as you say. It was very much about trying to get his voters out to vote. And this was the key to his victory. There was an increase in support between the first and turnout between the first and the second rounds among voters in rural areas. And in the smaller towns, and older voters as well. And a lot of the messaging on issues like the LGBT question, the question of sexual minorities, was about mobilizing that electorate. It's not the most important issue for anybody really in Poland, or not for very few people, but it's a very emotive issue that helps to mobilize traditionalist voters who are the key to Andrzej Duda's success. Those people in small towns, in villages who are quite traditionalist, culturally conservative, they needed to be mobilized to vote. And the law and justice banked on the fact that this was an issue, a kind of civilizational issue that will get them out to vote. There's also, incidentally, it was part of an attempt to try and paint Rafal Trzaskowski as a kind of liberal extremist, a representative of the urban liberal elite, because the center of gravity on the LGBT issue is to the right anyway. It's more conservative in Poland anyway, even among kind of centrist voters. And Andrzej Duda and Rafal Trzaskowski, for example, when he said he, as Warsaw mayor, as he said a couple of years ago, wanted to conduct a same-sex marriage, is well outside the mainstream of Polish views on sexual minorities. So it was also part of that. In terms of what it means for Poland, it means the law and justice government has a three-year clear run until the next national elections, when it can get on and implement its programme of radical state reform and transformation. If they'd lost the election, they would have a president that could veto their legislation, that could block their appointments. They don't have a majority in parliament, 3/5 majority needed overturn a presidential veto. Therefore, they would have been hamstrung, and we would have had a 3-year period of very messy, confrontational cohabitation. As it is, it has a clear 3-year run now till the next elections, controlling all the institutions of the state.
Alex, just a last question on the European Union. Trzaskowski was seen as the more pro-EU candidate. How much did that play a role in this election, and what kind of relationship might we see between Poland and the rest of the EU moving forward?
So the opposition and candidates like Rafal Trzaskowski try to present the Law and Justice government as being marginalised, out on a limb internationally. And his promise was that if he was elected, he would bring Poland back into the European mainstream. He would repair relations with the EU political establishment, with the Commission, the major EU powers. Law and Justice and Andrzej Duda tried to respond to this. Partly, this is what the visit to Washington, to Donald Trump was about before the first round, to show that Poland wasn't isolated internationally, but also arguing that the reason Poland finds itself in conflict with the EU political establishment is because it is standing up assertively for Poland's national interests. It's very easy to be part of the EU mainstream if you simply go along with all their policies. Now, what the government's going to be hoping is that now that the EU political establishment, the Commission, the main EU powers know that Law and Justice is going to be in office for 3 years and can get through its programme, it will come to terms with this and try and develop a working relationship. The government's strategy has been to try and separate out the big kind of issues, those big kind of ideological issues where they disagree with the EU political establishment, and the day-to-day pragmatic business of working on the single market, on the budget, all these kind of areas where it says Poland is a constructive member of the EU. Yes, we disagree about certain things, but we can work together. And it's hoping that the EU political establishment will separate those two things out, because that's been the government's strategy. It's adopted a twin track approach to the EU. On the one hand, accepting there are issues that they're going to clash with the EU political establishment about, but also trying to say this doesn't stop us from having constructive day-to-day relations. And it's hoping that it will change calculations within Brussels and the main EU powers so that they go along with this strategy and try and develop a pragmatic, business-like working relationship while accepting that they're going to disagree with Law and Justice about a lot of these kind of big ideological questions.
Alex, thanks for taking the time to speak to us. Aleks Szczerbiak, they're a politics professor at the University of Sussex.